Hello, I am Brian Baumgartner, and this is my critical reasoning final presentation. I will be analyzing the argument made in the article, Do Games Like Grand Theft Auto V Cause Real-World Violence? The author is Eric Kane, and the article can be found on Forbes.com. The argument is about censorship of violent video games. Here is the summary. The topic of video game censorship has come up in the news due to the release of the controversial and violent video game Grand Theft Auto V, and due to a mass shooting that took place the same week in Washington, D.C. Many news outlets have linked the two events, since the shooter was known to play violent video games frequently. However, studies on video games and violence have mixed results. Some studies show that they increase aggression, while other studies show the opposite. No study has ever shown that violent video games result in direct violence, let alone mass shootings. One study done by the Washington Post shows that although America has the highest gun-related murders per capita in the world, that Americans spend less money on video games than at least 8 other countries. Another study has shown that violent crimes have fallen in the U.S. over the last few years, while video game sales continue to rise. People who call for censorship of video games rarely play video games themselves. This would be akin to film censors who don't watch films or book censors who don't read. This creates a hollow sort of analysis. Although characters in Grand Theft Auto are morally reprehensible, most people who play the game see it as a virtual, temporary form of escapism, where they can do whatever they want without causing actual harm to anyone. Violent people are often drawn towards violent entertainment. Censoring the entertainment is unlikely to prevent people from committing mass murders or other violent crimes. The elephant in the room amongst all these shootings is untreated mental illness. We live in a society which allows many of its mentally ill to fall between the cracks, and it is easy for disturbed young men to gain access to firearms. Video games are an easy scapegoat for the media and politicians, but we cannot be as equally biased about how our media affects us gamers. Parents have a huge responsibility to understand and, yes, censor the media their children consume. Adult gamers have a similar responsibility toward their own cultivation of ideas and influences. Now for the premises. The first premise. Number 1. Some studies have shown that video games increase aggression. Some show the opposite, but no study has shown that video games result in actual violence. Number 2. Most supporters of video game censorship comes from people who are not gamers, so they can't fully analyze the effects of the game. Number 3. Untreated mental illness is the culprit of mass murders, and the murders are likely to happen without violent media. The conclusion. Video games are an easy scapegoat, but ultimately parents are responsible for the media their children consume, and adult gamers are responsible for their own cultivation of ideas and influences. Now on to the analysis. The conclusion does not follow from the premises very well. It was obvious from the premises in the article that the author is against censoring violent video games. However, the conclusion fails to mention violence at all, which was the main focus of the article. Also, children playing video games is only briefly mentioned 2 other times in the article. I believe most people would agree that children playing violent video games is a much different issue than whether games, which you must be 17 years or older to purchase, should be censored. The author is very rational in saying that adults are responsible because their children cannot legally purchase these games on their own. In that regards, the conclusion seems to hold fairly well. However, there were no supporting arguments or premises that lead up to this conclusion. The conclusion was good because it seems believable, and there are parts of the article that would support it. But overall, the conclusion was weak because it did not follow from the main premises in the article. The premises themselves were very good, with only a few minor flaws. The premises were designed to refute the claims made by various news outlets that the author discussed in the beginning of the article. The first and third premise were used to prove that violence in video games does not cause violence in real life. The second premise was designed to show that supporters of censoring video games do not understand the reason why normal, mentally healthy individuals play violent video games. Each of these premises would support the argument that violent video games should not be censored. Overall, the premises were good, and I'm going to break them down a little further individually. The first premise looked specifically at studies done on violent video games. The main study that was quoted was the study on the U.S. having the highest gun-related deaths, but not the highest video game spending. One flaw in the argument is that U.S. citizens generally pay less than citizens of other countries for video games. The basic reasons is because the lower prices in the U.S. Are from the games being released in English, while other countries games come in multiple languages, which require additional costs for translating and voice actors. Plus, the US has a higher population than most of the other countries, allowing companies to ship and sell in larger quantities. If you take the lower prices into account, the US is probably around third on the list of 10 in the article, rather than eighth. The main point of the study, though, is that US has 6 to 10 times the amount of gun-related murders as the other countries, with very little difference in video game spending. This study supports the author's third premise that there must be other factors other than video games to account for the US having such a high gun-related murder rate. Another study was briefly mentioned that showed US violent crime rate declining over the last few years despite increase in sales of video games. This argument isn't as strong because a simple correlation is not enough evidence to show that video games have no effect. It could be that crimes inspired by video games increased while other violent crimes decreased. However, this study wasn't referenced as heavily as the first, and it does a good enough job of providing additional evidence. However, the main problem with the first premise is that it goes a bit far in saying that no study has shown that video games result in actual violence. Although it may be true, there is no definitive way to prove it without searching through every study related to video game violence. Despite this, the first premise is strong in supporting the argument that violent video games do not lead to violence. The second premise is fairly self-explanatory. People that play violent video games wouldn't admit that games made them more violent, just as many people with other addictions, such as alcoholism, are reluctant to admit that their vices make them more violent. It is reasonable to assume, though, that most of the supporters of censorship have never tried playing video games for extended periods of time, or that many longtime gamers quit because they thought it made them more violent. However, with more serious addictions such as alcohol mentioned above, there are many former addicts that can attest to the fact that their addictions made them more violent. This assumption makes the second premise valid because supporters of censorship do not have a very good understanding of video games. I believe that the third premise is rather uncontroversial. Mental illness is a problem, and most people would agree that despite video game impacts, all of the mass shooters had serious, untreated mental illnesses. This premise does not need much support and does a good job of shifting the blame from video games. Even if video games provoke the shooters or push them over the edge, it is safe to say that the mental illness is the real cause of these acts. If the mental illnesses were treated, then the video games would be a non-issue, because a mentally sane person would not reproduce acts done in video games. This premise probably does the best job in supporting the argument that censoring violent video games is not the issue when it comes to mass shootings. This premise may also describe the high U.S. gun-related murder rates shown in the previous study. Overall, the argument is pretty solid. There are only a few minor flaws in the supporting arguments for the premises, but overall the premises did a great job showing that censorship is not needed for violent video games. The conclusion itself could use some improvement. Even though there is some evidence in the article to support the conclusion, and the conclusion itself seems valid, the conclusion does not follow very well from the premises. Although this does detract a lot from the argument, I wouldn't go as far to say it makes the entire argument bad. The premises and supporting evidence was good enough to prove his point that there should be no censorship of violent video games. Thank you.